The scream tore through the sterile consultation room like shattered glass, raw and primal, and Alexander Hawthorne felt each decibel pierce through the armor of his three-piece suit. His son Jamie, 5 years old, small for his age, with eyes that held too much confusion for a child, thrashed against the medical restraints as another specialist, attempted to fit the latest $8,000 hearing device into his tiny ear. Alexander's hands clenched uselessly at his sides, his knuckles white against the mahogany armrest of a chair that cost more than most people earned in a month. This was the 7th consultation in 3 months, the 19th specialist in 2 years, and his billionaire status meant nothing here in this room where his son's terror echoed off walls decorated with meaningless diplomas. Money had built empires, crushed competitors, and opened every door in Manhattan, but it couldn't stop the sound of his child's suffering. The specialist stepped back, shaking his head with that practiced sympathy that Alexander had learned to despise, and muttered something about behavioral challenges and pharmaceutical options. Jamie's small body went rigid, then limp, exhausted from fighting against a world he couldn't hear and a father he couldn't reach. Alexander moved forward, his expensive Italian shoes soundless on the hospital floor, and gathered his son into arms that felt increasingly foreign to both of them. The boy didn't resist, but he didn't lean in either, just existed in that hollow space between them, breathing hard, tear-stained cheeks pressed against Alexander's shoulder without seeking comfort. "Mr. Hawthorne, perhaps residential care might be," the doctor began, but Alexander silenced him with a look that had made corporate executives resign on the spot. He carried Jamie out past the waiting room, full of parents whose hope hadn't died yet, past the receptionist who wouldn't meet his eyes, into the autumn air that smelled of rain and failure. In his arms, Jamie stared at nothing, and Alexander realized with crushing certainty that he was holding his greatest success story in business and his most devastating failure as a father, and no amount of money could bridge that distance. Rosa Delgado arrived on a Thursday morning when the Hawthorne estate was wrapped in fog, carrying nothing but a canvas bag and a confidence that made Alexander's jaw tighten the moment she walked through his study doors. He'd been outvoted by his head of staff, who'd somehow decided this woman with her nursing credentials from Manila and her tourist visa stamp was more qualified than the 4 candidates from Johns Hopkins he'd personally selected. She was younger than he expected, maybe 30, with dark eyes that didn't waver when he explained that Jamie required specialized care, expensive protocols, adherence to the treatment schedule that cost more per month than she'd probably earn in a year. Rosa listened without interrupting, her hands folded calmly in her lap, and when he finished, she simply asked where Jamie was now, completely ignoring everything he'd just said. He found them 2 hours later in Jamie's room, and the scene stopped him cold in the doorway. The $1,000 sensory equipment sat unused in the corner. The prescribed hearing aids remained in their case, and Rosa sat cross-legged on the floor in complete silence with his son, who hadn't tolerated anyone's presence for more than 5 minutes in months. She wasn't trying to touch him, wasn't speaking or making therapeutic gestures, just sketching something in a notebook so worn its cover had separated from the spine. Jamie sat 3 feet away, watching her hands move across the paper with an attention Alexander hadn't seen in his son's eyes since before Sarah died. Rosa's pencil moved in slow, deliberate strokes, and somehow the silence between them felt like conversation, like something sacred Alexander didn't have permission to enter. "Miss Delgado, we have protocols," he started, his voice sharper than intended, shattering the quiet like a stone through ice. Rosa looked up, and her expression held no apology, no deference to his authority or his wealth. She closed the notebook, stood with fluid grace, and walked past him into the hallway, gesturing for him to follow, her body language making it clear this conversation wouldn't happen in front of Jamie. In the corridor, she turned to face him, and Alexander felt something shift in the air between them, a challenge he wasn't accustomed to receiving in his own home. "Your protocols have failed him," Rosa said softly, her accent giving the words a weight that made them land harder than any corporate negotiation he'd survived. She didn't raise her voice, didn't show anger, just stated it as simple fact, while somewhere behind them, Jamie remained. Sitting in that room, still quiet, still waiting for something the expensive equipment had never provided. Alexander followed Rosa into the empty music room, his anger coiling tight in his chest, ready to dismiss her the way he dismissed every other caregiver who thought they knew better than medical science. But before he could speak, she reached into her canvas bag and pulled out something that stopped his words cold. A wooden flute, ancient and carved, with intricate patterns, its surface worn smooth by decades of handling. She held it between them like an offering, like a secret, and when she spoke, her voice carried a truth that made the air in the room feel suddenly thin. I was born profoundly deaf, Mr. Hawthorne, in a village outside Manila where your money means nothing and doctors don't come. She watched his face change, watched understanding dawn and clash with his assumptions, and continued without mercy for his discomfort. My grandmother taught me that sound isn't something you hear first. It's something you feel, something that lives in your bones before it ever reaches your ears. She moved to the grand piano that sat untouched since Sarah's death, its surface thick with dust that caught the morning light filtering through tall windows. Rosa placed the flute on the closed lid, then pressed her palm flat against the piano's side, her other hand, gesturing for him to do the same, creating an intimacy he wanted to resist but couldn't. Your son doesn't need another device telling him he's broken, another machine reminding him what he's missing, she said, her fingers now moving to trace the flute's carvings, each groove a story Alexander would never know. He needs to understand that the world speaks in more languages than sound, that vibration is conversation, that connection happens here. She touched her sternum right above her heart, before it ever happens here, and she tapped her ear with a sadness that suggested loss he couldn't fathom. Alexander stared at the flute, at this woman who'd walked into his fortress of wealth and grief, armed with nothing but wood and lived experience, and felt something crack in his chest. The specialist said sensory integration, auditory processing therapy, cochlear implant candidacy evaluation. He heard himself listing the expensive terms like prayer, like incantation, desperate to maintain the illusion that money could solve what love had failed to fix. Rosa picked up the flute, held it to her lips but didn't play, just let him see the instrument that had survived oceans and decades to arrive in this moment. Your specialists see a medical case, Mr. Hawthorne, she said, lowering the flute, her eyes holding his with uncomfortable clarity. But I see a boy who's drowning. In silence, because everyone keeps shouting solutions at him instead of sitting in the quiet and learning his language first. She walked past him toward the door, the flute tucked against her side like a child, and paused just long enough to deliver her final blow. You can fire me now, or you can let me show Jamie that being deaf isn't something to fix. It's something to honor while we teach him that the world vibrates with life he's always been able to feel. If only someone would stop trying to make him hear. The choice hung in the air between them, heavy as fog, and Alexander realized with devastating clarity that for all his billions, this woman with her grandmother's flute held the only key that might unlock his son's silence. Alexander woke to an empty house, that particular quality of silence that signals absence rather than peace, and his heart seized with the old familiar panic that had lived in his chest since Sarah died. He moved through hallways still dark with pre-dawn shadows, Jamie's bedroom door open, bed empty, the expensive monitoring system they'd installed flashing uselessly because it couldn't track where his son had gone, or why. Then he saw them through the eastern windows, two figures moving across the dew-soaked lawn toward the lake, toward the place he'd forbidden everyone to go since the accident, since water had become synonymous with loss. He ran, his bare feet cold against marble, then grass, his breath sharp in his throat, but stopped short when he reached the tree line and saw what Rosa had created in the forbidden space. She'd arranged hollow logs in a semicircle at the water's edge, each one a different size, each one positioned so Jamie could touch them while feeling the lake's gentle movement against the shore. The boy sat cross-legged on a flat stone, his small hand pressed against a log, while Rosa knelt in the shallow water, the ancient flute held just beneath the surface, playing notes that became ripples, became vibration, became something Alexander had no name for. Jamie's face held an expression his father had never seen, not happiness exactly, but presence, an aliveness that made the boy look suddenly older and infinitely more himself. Rosa would play a pattern of notes, the water would dance and shiver, and Jamie would feel it through the log, through the stone, through his bones, then try to replicate the rhythm by drumming his palms against the wood. Sometimes he'd laugh, that sound Alexander had heard only once, and reach into the water himself, creating his own ripples, his own conversation with vibration and movement. The sun broke over the tree line, turning the lake gold, and Alexander watched his son learn a language he'd spent 5 years and $10 million trying to force into existence through steroids and surgery and specialist consultations. Rosa looked up then, water dripping from the flute, and met Alexander's eyes across the distance without apology or explanation, her expression asking a single question he finally knew how to answer. He stepped forward instead of commanding them back, removed his shoes instead of imposing rules, and when Rosa offered him a hollow log and gestured toward the water, Alexander Hawthorne knelt in the shallows beside his son and felt music for the very first time. The breakthrough came 3 days later when Jamie laughed again, a pure sound of delight as a dragonfly landed on his wet fingertips, and Alexander felt something crack open inside his chest like ice breaking under spring sun. He stood abruptly, water sloshing around his knees, his hands shaking, and when Rosa looked at him with concern, he couldn't stop the words that had lived like poison in his throat for 5 years. "I killed her," he said, his voice breaking on each syllable, and Jamie looked up at the tone, if not the words, sensing the shift in atmosphere the way he'd learned to sense everything Rosa had taught him. Rosa stood slowly, water streaming from her clothes, and guided Alexander away from the lake's edge to a fallen log where they could sit while Jamie continued playing, the boy's attention mercifully absorbed by patterns of light on water. Alexander told her everything then, the confession pouring out in fragments and gasps. How Sarah had complained of feeling ill during her 7th month, how he'd been closing the Singapore acquisition and couldn't leave the negotiations, how he'd sent their personal physician instead of coming home himself. He described returning 4 days later to find her unconscious, the placental infection raging through her bloodstream, the emergency delivery that saved Jamie but cost Sarah everything, the specialists explaining that the infection had destroyed the developing auditory nerves. "I chose a business deal over my wife," he whispered, his face in his hands, his shoulders heaving with sobs he'd never allowed himself. "I told her the acquisition was too important, that Dr. Morrison would handle everything, and when they called to say she was critical, I was signing papers worth $2 billion, while my son was being born deaf and my wife was dying." Rosa sat quietly beside him, her hand resting on his back, not offering empty comfort or false absolution, just presence, the same gift she'd given Jamie those first silent hours. "You cannot buy back time," she finally said, her accent thick with emotion, her own voice carrying weight of losses Alexander didn't yet know. "You cannot fix the past with money or guilt or punishment, Mr. Hawthorne, only with becoming the Father Jamie needs now, in this moment, with these broken pieces." She turned his face toward the lake where his son sat playing in sunlight, creating beauty from vibration and trust, alive despite everything that had tried to diminish him. Alexander watched through tears as Jamie looked back at them, the boy's expression showing awareness of his father's pain even without hearing the words, and in that moment of connection across silence, something shifted. Not redemption exactly, but the possibility of it. the first trembling note of forgiveness playing itself into existence through water and light, and the stubborn hope of a woman who understood that healing sometimes requires breaking open first. The immigration agents arrived on a Thursday morning when the lake mist still clung to the grass like grief, their black sedan cutting through the estate's iron gates with bureaucratic precision that respected neither wealth nor miracle. Alexander was in his study negotiating with the fourth immigration attorney that week when Mrs. Chen knocked with unusual urgency. Her composed face cracked with alarm, and through the window he saw Jamie and Rosa returning from their dawn session, the boy's small hand clasped in hers, both of them laughing at some private joke told through signs and expressions. The agents emerged from their vehicle with folders and official expressions, and Rosa saw them immediately, her body going rigid with recognition, even as she tried to smile down at Jamie, tried to keep the fear from translating into the vibrations he'd learned to read so precisely. Alexander was already moving, taking stairs 3 at a time, his phone pressed to his ear, demanding his attorney meet them immediately. But he knew with sick certainty that paperwork moved slower than enforcement, that money couldn't rewrite visa dates already expired by 17 days. Rosa knelt on the gravel driveway as the agents approached, her hands trembling as she signed something to Jamie that Alexander couldn't interpret. Her eyes brimming with tears she fought to contain, because the boy would feel them like earthquakes if she let go. The senior agent, a woman with grey-streaked hair and tired eyes, explained the situation with practiced sympathy. Expired tourist visa, overstayed work without proper authorization, immediate deportation proceedings already filed, while Rosa nodded understanding she'd clearly known was coming, had probably been dreading, since the day she'd accepted this position. Jamie watched the exchange with growing confusion, his gaze moving between the strangers and Rosa, his small hand clutching her sleeve with increasing desperation as he sensed the wrongness radiating from every adult present, the fear that hummed through his father's. Rapid breathing and Rosa's forced calm. Alexander began explaining his legal team's efforts, his voice rising with desperation and barely restrained fury at systems that couldn't bend fast enough. But the junior agent was already reaching for Rosa's arm with gentle insistence, protocol demanding immediate custody, pending deportation hearing. Scheduled for the following week. That's when Jamie moved, his small body suddenly animated with understanding beyond his 5 years, breaking from Rosa's side to run back to her with arms outstretched, and from his throat came a sound that shattered the morning like glass, breaking in a cathedral. "No!" The word ripped from somewhere deep in his chest, raw and imperfect and absolutely unmistakable, his first spoken word, launched like a weapon against the universe that kept taking people he loved, and the sound hung in the air while every adult froze in collective shock. The senior agent's hand stopped mid-reach, her eyes widening with recognition of what she'd just witnessed, while Alexander felt his knees weaken with the impossible weight of hearing his son's voice for the first time, that single syllable containing every prayer he'd offered to gods he didn't believe in. Rosa sobbed openly now, pulling Jamie against her chest while he repeated the word with increasing volume and desperation, "No, no, no." Each repetition, stronger as 5 years of silence broke open into sound, and even the junior agent stepped back as if recognizing they stood at the threshold of something sacred. Alexander found his voice finally, hoarse with tears and wonder, turning to the agents with hands outstretched in supplication rather than the commanding authority he usually wielded, and spoke the only truth that mattered in that shattered morning. "You just heard my son speak his first word. Please, please don't let it be goodbye." The immigration hearing became a media spectacle within 48 hours, Jamie's miracle transforming from private breakthrough into public fascination as news outlets seized upon the deaf. Billionaire's son speaking his first word to save his nurse from deportation. Alexander's legal team worked with surgical precision, filing emergency petitions and humanitarian appeals while deploying every connection his wealth commanded. And by the third day, they'd secured a temporary stay that felt less like victory than borrowed time slipping. Through desperate fingers, Rosa moved through the estate like a ghost during those suspended days, continuing Jamie's therapy with mechanical dedication while something fundamental dimmed behind her eyes, and Alexander caught her twice, standing at windows with packed bags beside her feet, as if rehearsing departures she knew were inevitable. Who tried everything, offered permanent employment with whatever visa classification money could expedite, proposed adoption proceedings that would legally bind her to Jamie's care, even suggested marriage in purely transactional terms that made his attorneys wince. But Rosa deflected each solution with quiet refusal that felt like grief wearing politeness as a mask. On the sixth night, Alexander found her in the music room where she'd first played her grandmother's flute for Jamie, moonlight streaming through tall windows to illuminate tears tracking silently down her face as she held that ancient wooden instrument like a talisman against fate. He entered without knocking, exhausted from days of legal warfare and the particular helplessness of watching his son ask in signs why Rosa seemed sad, why she kept touching his face like memorizing topography before blindness. She didn't startle at his presence, merely turned with the weary acceptance of someone who'd been expecting this conversation, this reckoning that hung between them since the immigration agents first arrived. "You can stay," Alexander said, the words emerging rough with sleeplessness and desperation. "The attorneys confirmed it this afternoon. Humanitarian visa approved based on Jamie's medical needs and your specialized expertise. You're not going anywhere, Rosa." But instead of relief, her face crumpled with something darker than grief, a pain so profound it seemed to age her in the moonlight as she shook her head slowly, and when she spoke, her voice carried the hollow quality of confessions extracted from wounded places. "I can hear now because I chose surgery over everything else," Rosa whispered, her hand pressed against her abdomen in a gesture of absence that made Alexander's breath catch. "Experimental procedure 10 years ago that restored my hearing but destroyed my reproductive system. The specialist said I'd have to choose between sound and children, and I was young and foolish and so desperate to hear music the way my grandmother described it." She laughed bitterly, tears falling faster as the flute trembled in her grip, and continued with brutal honesty that cut like confession and accusation combined. "Every day with Jamie fills the emptiness where my own children should have been, and every night I hate myself for loving him like he's mine when I'm just the nurse who'll eventually leave, because that's what people like me do. We fix broken things, then disappear before we can break them differently." Alexander crossed the room without conscious decision, taking the flute gently from her shaking hands and setting it aside before grasping her shoulders with intensity that demanded she meet his eyes, his voice fierce with certainty that surprised them both. "You didn't fix my son with therapy or technique. You loved him whole again, with every dawn session and patient silence. And that's not something temporary or professional or easily replaced by the next qualified specialist," he said, the words tumbling out with uncharacteristic rawness as months of watching her transform their lives crystallized into clarity. "Jamie doesn't need another nurse, and I'm not offering you employment anymore. I'm asking you to stay because you're already his mother in every way that matters, and your inability to give birth doesn't make you less of the miracle we needed." Rosa's revelation hung between them like suspended glass, beautiful and fragile in the moonlight, but morning brought clinical reality as Alexander summoned every specialist his wealth could command to examine the impossible thing she'd accomplished where science had repeatedly failed. The medical team arrived within hours, neurologists from Johns Hopkins, audiologists from specialized institutes in Switzerland, developmental experts who'd published groundbreaking research on pediatric hearing loss, and they descended upon Jamie with sophisticated equipment that transformed the music room into a makeshift laboratory humming with diagnostic machinery. Alexander watched from the doorway as his son submitted to yet another round of testing, but this time Jamie kept reaching for Rosa's hand between procedures, and she held him steady with the patient certainty of someone who'd already proven miracles didn't require expensive technology. The lead neurologist, a severe woman named Dr. Catherine Walsh, whose reputation preceded her like cold wind, spent 3 days running comprehensive auditory processing tests, brain imaging, scans, and behavioral assessments that measured what conventional medicine insisted shouldn't exist. When Dr. Walsh finally called them into Alexander's study for results, her expression carried the peculiar bewilderment of someone watching their foundational beliefs crack under irrefutable evidence, and she spread brain scans across his mahogany, desk-like cards, revealing an unexpected hand. Jamie's auditory cortex shows neuroplastic changes consistent with intensive therapeutic stimulation, but the pattern doesn't match anything in existing literature, she explained, pointing to illuminated regions that glowed like constellations against the dark scan background, her clinical tone barely masking profound confusion. The vibrational therapy Ms. Delgado employed somehow triggered dormant neural pathways to reorganize and strengthen, creating new connections between sensory processing centers that effectively restored partial hearing through alternative neurological routes. She paused, removing her glasses to meet Alexander's gaze directly, and continued with the careful honesty of someone admitting professional limitations. Your son's improvement isn't medical recovery in traditional terms. It's neurological adaptation, facilitated by consistent emotional bonding and multisensory engagement that no pharmaceutical intervention or surgical procedure could have achieved, because it required something we can't prescribe or replicate. Alexander felt Rosa tense beside him as Dr. Walsh turned her attention from scans to the woman who'd accomplished what entire medical teams couldn't, studying her with clinical fascination that bordered on reverence despite obvious skepticism about unconventional methods. You worked with him daily for how long? 3 months? And you incorporated water therapy, vibrational instruments, tactile music interpretation, all while maintaining what his previous therapists describe as unusually intimate emotional connection. The questions emerged rapid-fire as Dr. Walsh consulted thick files containing reports from specialists who'd failed Jamie before Rosa arrived, her tone shifting from interrogation to genuine curiosity about methodology that defied standard protocols. Rosa nodded slowly, her hand finding Jamie's as he pressed against her side, and when she spoke, her voice carried quiet certainty that needed no medical terminology to validate truth. I taught him that. Sound is connection before frequency, that hearing begins in the heart before it reaches the brain, and that love creates pathways that fear and isolation destroy. Dr. Walsh closed her files with deliberate finality, and what she said next transformed clinical assessment into something resembling benediction as she looked between Alexander's desperate hope and Rosa's exhausted determination with unexpected gentleness. Miss Delgado, whatever you did, whether through legitimate neuroplastic stimulation or some mechanism we don't yet understand, you've given this child functional hearing that didn't exist 3 months ago, and that makes you more valuable to his continued development than any specialist I could recommend, she stated with professional authority that carried weight beyond opinion, then added with rare warmth that cracked her severe demeanor. If Mr. Hawthorne has any sense, he'll do whatever necessary to keep you in this boy's life permanently, because what you share isn't something medical science can replicate or replace. It's the kind of connection that changes neurology precisely because it first changes everything else. Rosa's suitcase lay open on the guest room bed, like a wound exposing all the temporary nature of her presence in their lives. and she folded clothes with mechanical precision that betrayed the trembling in her fingers as Alexander watched from the doorway, unable to find words that wouldn't sound like begging. The immigration victory sat hollow between them, her visa extended, her legal status secure, all the bureaucratic barriers his wealth had demolished. Yet none of it mattered against the wall she'd built from noble intentions and devastating certainty that she didn't belong in their world permanently. Jamie needs stability, structure, professionals who understand child development through proper channels, she said without meeting Alexander's eyes, repeating arguments that sounded rehearsed and desperately rational, as if logic could protect her heart from what leaving would actually cost. He wanted to argue that Jamie needed her specifically, that stability meant nothing without the person who taught his son to hear through love rather than technology. But Rosa's resolve had the quality of someone who'd already made peace with necessary sacrifice. Downstairs, Jamie sat in the music room, surrounded by instruments Rosa had introduced. The hollow logs, crystal bowls, her grandmother's wooden flute resting across his small lap like sacred trust. And Alexander found him there as afternoon light painted everything golden and bittersweet with impending loss. The boy looked up with eyes that held too much understanding for 5 years, and Alexander realized with crushing clarity that Jamie knew Rosa was leaving, could feel it in the changed vibrations of the household, the way her laughter had grown careful, and her embraces lingered too long, like memorizing textures against coming emptiness. "She thinks we'll be fine without her," Alexander said quietly, kneeling beside his son who'd become whole under Rosa's care, and Jamie's expression, crumpled with the particular devastation of children who've learned that love doesn't always mean staying. Together, they sat in silence that Rosa had taught them could speak louder than words, and Alexander watched Jamie lift the ancient flute with sudden determination, his small fingers tracing its worn surface as if searching for answers carved in wood that had survived generations. 3 hours later, as Rosa descended the stairs with her packed suitcase and composure held together by pure willpower, Jamie appeared at the landing, holding the wooden flute extended toward her, like an offering that stopped her mid-step and shattered her careful farewell preparations. She took it with shaking hands, confused because she'd planned to leave it with him as legacy and comfort. But then she saw the fresh carving along its length, crude letters painstakingly etched by child hands that must have worked through the afternoon with fierce concentration. The words, spelled out in uneven script, read, "You are my miracle too," and Rosa's carefully constructed resolve collapsed completely as she sank onto the stairs, clutching the flute against her chest, while sobs broke through defenses that noble intentions couldn't maintain against this pure declaration. Alexander stood below, watching the woman who'd healed his son break open under the weight of being loved back just as fiercely. And he understood that some departures were impossible, not because of legal barriers or practical obstacles, but because hearts had already rewritten the definition of family in ways that made leaving an amputation none of them would survive intact. Manila's humidity wrapped around them like embrace as Alexander and Jamie stepped from the car onto the narrow street where Rosa's family home stood, painted in faded coral, its windows open to catch whatever breeze might offer mercy, and he felt his corporate armor dissolve under the weight of what he was about to do in this place where his wealth meant nothing compared to the richness of connection. Jamie's hand tightened in his as neighborhood children paused their games to stare at the foreigners who looked lost and determined simultaneously, and Alexander recognized Rosa's eyes in her grandmother's face when the elderly woman appeared in the doorway, with recognition blooming into shock. She called out in Tagalog, and Rosa emerged from the house's dim interior looking sun-kissed and radiant in ways the estate had never quite captured, and Alexander watched her freeze when she saw them standing in the street holding luggage and hope like pilgrims who'd crossed oceans for absolution. "You came," she whispered, as Jamie broke free and ran to her with the wooden flute clutched against his chest. and Alexander saw tears transform her face into something between joy and disbelief that made his prepared speech dissolve into simpler truth. "Marry me," he said without preamble or poetry, standing in the dusty street while neighbors gathered with the frank curiosity of communities where privacy was communal myth, and Rosa stared at him like he'd spoken a language she couldn't translate, despite understanding every word. "Not because you healed my son, or because I'm grateful, or because it makes practical sense for Jamie's development, but because you taught me that miracles aren't purchased with money. They're built through presence, patience, and the courage to show up broken and trust someone else to help carry the—" "Wait!" Jamie pressed the flute into Rosa's hands again, and she looked between father and son, with defenses crumbling under the assault of being chosen not as employee or temporary salvation, but as permanent family. Alexander pulled documents from his bag, showing architectural plans for the Rosa Maria Delgado Hearing Center, named for her grandmother, funded completely and designed to bring her vibration therapy to children across the Philippines who needed healing. His wealth could finally serve rather than fail. "You built me a center," Rosa breathed, scanning designs that proved he'd listened to every passionate midnight conversation about reaching deaf children through connection rather than just clinical intervention. And Alexander saw the moment her last resistance broke like dawn, pushing through storm clouds. "I built us a purpose," he corrected, closing the distance between them while her grandmother wept openly and neighbors applauded without fully understanding the narrative they were witnessing. "Jamie needs you as his mother. I need you as my partner. And hundreds of children need what only you can give, because you understand that hearing isn't just about sound. It's about being witnessed, valued, and loved through whatever communication makes the heart feel less alone." Rosa cupped his face with hands that had healed his son and transformed his understanding of what wealth actually meant. And when she kissed him, it tasted like mangoes and salt water, and the particular sweetness of finding home in unexpected places. 6 months later, the center opened with Jamie cutting the ribbon alongside Rosa, while Alexander watched his wife work with children whose families couldn't afford the treatments his money had once wasted, and he understood finally that love's true miracle wasn't fixing what was broken, but discovering that brokenness itself could become the foundation for building something more beautiful than perfection ever achieved alone. What miracle have you been searching for in all the wrong places? Subscribe to discover more stories that prove love transforms everything it touches.